TellyCast, the TV industry news review.
Hi, I'm Justin Crosby, and welcome to this week's TellyCast. It's a soap special on this week's show, and my guests are Jason Herbison, executive producer of Neighbours, and Iain MacLeod, series producer of Coronation Street. And whilst content clairvoyant Gertz Leasis attempts to traverse Europe to fulfil various business meetings in different countries, we're joined by Gertz's colleague and K7 Media non-executive director, and a very familiar name to many in the global TV business, Gary Carter, who talks us through the history, significance, and some surprising connections between soaps around the world. It's all coming up on this week's TellyCast. So on this week's show, I'm delighted to welcome the senior producers of two of the longest running and best loved drama series in the world. Jason Herbison is a writer and producer with 25 years experience in the Australian television industry and is executive producer of Neighbours. Produced by Fremantle in Melbourne, Australia, Neighbours is a television institution, having first broadcast on March the 18th, 1985. And nearly 8,500 episodes later, the nightly series has rightly earned its place in the history books as one of the longest running and most successful drama series of all time. The brainchild of TV pioneers Reg Grundy and Reg Watson, Neighbours was created to work both in Australia and the United Kingdom. Watson set about creating a drama that would draw on his experience of growing up in the outer suburbs and spotlight the highs and lows of a group of families through a daily dose of high drama and humour. Fast forward 35 years, Ramsay Street in Erinsborough has become one of the world's most recognisable addresses, and some of the original family dynasties still remain today, with many new ones added over the years. And joining Jason is Iain MacLeod, series producer of Coronation Street. Iain started work for ITV in 2006, where he got his first foot on the continuing drama ladder as an assistant researcher at Coronation Street. Since then, he's worked in various roles, including story editor at Coronation Street and series producer at Emmerdale. Coronation Street was the brainchild of 23-year-old Tony Warren, whose first episode was broadcast live on the 9th of December 1960. Initially intended for a run of 13 episodes, the twice-weekly show was a runaway success. By the following summer, it hit number one in the weekly TV viewing charts for the first time. Original characters such as Ina Sharples, Annie Walker and Elsie Tanner became TV icons over the next 20 years. In 1969, the show began broadcasting in colour, and its popularity continued to grow, with an exterior backlot created, allowing the street to move out of the studio for the first time. A third weekly episode was added in 1989, with a fourth following in 1996. The show's 50th anniversary in 2010 featured a dramatic tram crash in a flawless live episode. Since 2017, Coronation Street has been broadcasting 6 times a week, and issue-based plots have taken their place alongside the familiar, heartwarming and emotionally charged stories that have been the backbone of the series since the start. In February 2020, the landmark 10,000th episode was broadcast, and the 60th anniversary takes place in December. So, welcome to the show, Jason and Iain.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having me also.
It's fantastic that we have two senior producers of the longest running and most respected soaps in the world. We're really honoured to have you guys on the show. Jason, coming to you first, can you tell us about when you stopped production on Neighbours and what that was like, and for how long did you shut down production?
We stopped production on March 27, definitely a couple of weeks into the world panic of the pandemic. I think we were one of the last shows to shut down. It had been a couple of very difficult weeks before that as we tried to figure out what was going on and what was happening around the world and what the future was going to be. But we shut down on March 27. And then the following Monday, a few of us producers kind of just got together and went, right, what are we going to do? What do we know? How can we move forward? And we came up with a plan, and then we were back up in 3.5 weeks after that.
3.5 weeks. Wow. I expected that the shutdown would have been a lot longer than that. Which channels does Neighbours currently go out? And it's Channel 5 in the UK, isn't it?
Yeah, Channel 5 and Network 10 here in Australia.
And how did you handle the shutdown with those networks? How many shows did they have in reserve?
Well, two parts to the question. Both 5 and 10 were incredibly supportive. And obviously, this wasn't a unique situation to Neighbours. It was happening to every one of their productions. So we just maintained a very close dialogue with them daily, really, as those weeks unfolded. And then we got to the 27th and we realised we had to shut down. At that point in time, we had enough episodes to run till about early June on both channels. At that point, they were both same-day TX. We weren't sure exactly if we could get up, in 3.5 weeks' time. That was something that unfolded in the weeks that followed. But yes, we managed to get up, and here we are.
Ian, was that a similar situation for Coronation Street? Am I right in saying that you shut down for a little bit longer than that?
We did shut down for longer than that. I mean, it's an astonishing achievement from everyone at Neighbours to get on the air or get up and filming again so quickly. It really is. In our case, heading into lockdown was made more complicated by the fact that I had coronavirus at the time. I certainly think I did anyway, even down to having had the mysterious COVID toe, as it's now called. So I was really, really quite unwell for the last 2 weeks of filming, and my wife is the assistant producer, so was running the show very ably in my absence. But as I'm sure Jason will attest, it was really challenging. Certainly in this neck of the woods, you had anyone that had any kinds of symptoms quite correctly was self-isolating, but that meant that actors were dropping like flies. I went back through a script recently from around that time, and one of the scenes I think had been rewritten 4 times to take out this character and put this character in to replace them, and then that character had to be removed, and then another character had to be removed, and then therefore the scene was suddenly only one person, which wasn't going to work. So then a whole new scene was written, and then somebody was taken out of that because they weren't able to come to work. So it was kind of extreme chaos, and then followed very quickly by absolute silence because we shut down. That happened very abruptly when it became apparent the situation wasn't safe. So we went from that kind of chaotic world of everybody, all hands to the pump, to everybody down to tools. And much like Jason's saying, there was a lot of very in-depth conversations about how do we do this? Can we do this really? Can we make the show that people will still recognize as Coronation Street and do it within these new parameters, these new safety restrictions? And we quite quickly decided that we could, but it required a huge undertaking in terms of rewriting scripts. I think we rewrote from top to bottom about 80 episodes worth of script to conform to social distancing, to remove location filming. It was a mammoth task really from our writers and our script editing team. But it genuinely was the case that on day one, the big question was, can we do this? Is it safe? Will we have to just wait for the pandemic to pass before we can restart? But it was an immense relief to realise, no, we can do this. And again, we reduced our TX pattern to 3 episodes a week, where normally we'd do 6. But actually, we didn't run out of episodes. We've stayed on the air, and yeah, I'm immensely proud of the team.
In an earlier telecast, we spoke about the importance of soaps, not only to networks, because obviously the number of hours per week and sort of being the cornerstone of the schedule, but also as like a lighthouse for the channel when people's lives have been disrupted to the extent of which they have over the last few months. And they almost act as this beacon for people to coming back to the channel, and people associate the show with that channel. How about the audiences? Because obviously it's a way of life, Coronation Street, to the audience. Must have a real sense of duty, if you like, to keep the show on the air and keep the show going for people who've been watching the show for decades.
At the risk of sounding slightly pretentious, for lots of the lockdown period in the UK, people didn't see their family members. I know it's a well-worn cliche, but for some people, the characters on Coronation Street are like family members. So I definitely think that for some people who are very isolated and very alone, that kind of normality that Coronation Street brings and that familiarity, and seeing those characters that do feel like members of their extended family, was deeply reassuring and comforting for a lot of people. And certainly the correspondence I received throughout lockdown would support that view. So yeah, quite apart from the commercial pressure on a show to stay on the air and keep producing programs, there was a certain amount of cultural and emotional pressure on us because people relied on this show. It's, as you say, it's been going for decades and decades. We're in our 60th year, and people would have been, I think, heartbroken had it suddenly vanished from the TV listings. And in a purely selfish, self-preservation way, I didn't want to be the producer that presided over the era when Coronation Street failed to make it to TX. So You know, there was a little bit of that going on as well, the kind of professional pride. Mostly it was about not letting the audience down, not letting the viewers down. And actually, at the risk of blowing our own trumpet slightly, Coronation Street and the soaps generally have outperformed the market during lockdown, certainly in the UK. So where obviously there was an uptick in TV viewing generally from lockdown onwards because people were stuck at home and watched more television, but actually even controlling for that variable, Coronation Street has seen a really vast uptick in its audience beyond what has been experienced across the schedule. So I think that tells its own story in terms of how important that show is to the public.
Many people feel that soaps have a role to essentially reflect diversity and reflect social issues in society. And I've seen that Neighbours has been doing a lot of that when it comes to relationships and diversity and lots of different key issues. How about coronavirus? I mean, have you featured coronavirus in your storylines?
We haven't. It's funny, when this began, the first thing we all thought was, oh, fantastic, now we'll do a pandemic story. I don't know about you, Ian, but in our story planning, we have for years sort of had up on the board pandemic as one of many sorts of stories that we've never done, but we might do one day. I've always shot it down going, it's not realistic. You know, and it's always been one of the stories that we've not really been able to figure out how to tell. So, of course, a real life pandemic hits and you go, oh, initial reaction, great, we can do something with this. But as we paused and thought about it, there were sort of two things. There was a practical consideration and then a creative consideration. The practical one was that we write so many months in advance. You know, so we're talking about back in March. What we were writing back in March still hasn't aired yet. So the first issue was, what can we write that's still going to be relevant in X number of months' time when it finally goes to air? We couldn't know. And in fact, had we written a pandemic story back in March, it would have been wrong, because here we are now and we're all wearing masks to work. And, you know, that wasn't really something we were thinking back in March. So there were practical things like that. But probably the bigger one, which really harks back to what you were both talking about, was a creative reason. I certainly thought about it and thought, it's so grim out in the world. I know how I felt personally, even 1, 2, 3 weeks into this back in April. It was just so grim. It was so overwhelming. And I just thought, do people really want to watch Neighbours and feel this? And if I could have done it in time and made it relevant, then it would have been a different story. But putting those two pieces together, it probably was not something we should try to do. But having said that, we have done little things. I think we all recognise that even when this is over, the world is going to have changed. Our behaviour is all going to be quite different, probably for years. So we have incorporated little things like that. I kind of think of it as though it's as if the pandemic did hit Australia, but it sort of passed by our suburb. And our people in the aftermath have maybe picked up some of the, you know, the hygiene or the social distancing. They've picked up some of those things, but we haven't actually shown, you know, the full brunt of it.
Will you refer to it happening or no?
We were in the middle of doing a big story about one of our playing areas turning green, becoming environmentally sound, you know, reusing things, all this kind of thing. And it was quite a big story. And as we were filming this story, suddenly we're like, actually, we can't do any of that anymore. We've got to have disposable everything. Nobody can touch anything. So we actually had a storyline that, you know, itself, it was going to be too contradictory if we did this storyline about our workplace turning green, but at the same time we're talking about a pandemic where suddenly everything is plastic and disposable and in bags.
So you're reflecting behavioural change, but you're not explicitly talking about the COVID-19, essentially.
That was our choice based on everything I just described. There were a few factors in there. I know some shows are referencing it, and I'm really interested to see how they are. I really support them in that choice as well. But we felt, for a multitude of reasons, that we couldn't. Now, that's not to say that at some point in the future, Paul Robinson isn't going to make some remark about, you know, thank God that pandemic's over or something. In terms of what we plotted, in terms of what we were filming, in terms of the behaviours of our characters who did still need to interact. I mean, of course, we've got all of the protocols in place as we film the storylines, but we make it appear as though they're touching each other and they're having all that contact. So it was just going to be too contradictory for us to put it in the storyline, but yet have our characters behaving in a way that was not in line with the way people should be behaving in the pandemic.
How about you, Ian? What choice have you made when it comes to being explicit about COVID-19?
Our starting point was very similar, which is that I don't think people tune in at 7:30 to watch a kind of COVID-heavy episode of Coronation Street. And certainly during most of lockdown, all anyone spoke about all day was coronavirus, and you kind of want to turn on the TV and see something that will take you out of that world for a little bit. But so we wanted to make sure our stories were not really about coronavirus. We've gone a bit further with the kind of visual evidence of the pandemic. We did have signage up in the Rovers saying, please maintain 2 metre distance. And people have been wearing masks going into shops in the most part. And there's lots of evidence of hand washing. And there were some gentle references to lockdown type experiences in dialogue. So we went slightly further with our depiction of it, but we also felt like, we don't want to have a story in the show where somebody gets desperately ill as a result of catching COVID-19 or anything like that. So there's the escapism element of Coronation Street still very front and centre in what we're doing. But I think, we've taken the view that maybe we've got an angrier public over here. In the early phase of lockdown, we're putting out episodes which were filmed long before coronavirus was even a thing. So clearly nobody was wearing masks, nobody was washing their hands, there was no social distancing, people were going into pubs and slapping each other on the back. And our duty log, our viewer services complaints log, just filled up with hundreds and thousands of people saying we were irresponsible and how could you put this on the television, and you should be normalising good biosecurity procedures and protocols. This is disgraceful. And obviously we were putting a disclaimer on the front of the show saying this was filmed before the pandemic, but people felt that wasn't an excuse, partly because of the kind of cultural atmosphere around the whole issue. It made sense for us to depict a little bit more than Jason is describing. As far as possible, we wanted to maintain the show as it was and tell the stories we were still telling and make sure that we dealt with the coronavirus visuals with a kind of light touch and didn't splatter it all over the screen, really. So I think we've got the balance right based on what the audience response has been. One never knows. I mean, Jason's entirely right when he says that we are trying to hit a moving target, because the rules here, I'm sure it's much the same in Australia, are apt to change day by day. So what we are filming now in terms of people's usage of masks, let's say, or their ability to go and sit in the pub, which currently is okay as long as you're not mixing with other people, that might change by the time these episodes go to air. But we've done a fair amount of market research that says within certain bounds, the public are quite forgiving if we're not bang on the money. They accept we're not a documentary. So we've accepted, and I think our audience will accept, that sometimes we'll be a bit wide of the mark with the specifics. In the most part, the audience has responded really well to it so far.
Jason, you're talking to us from Melbourne. Ian, you're in Manchester. And these are two cities that actually are now almost hotspots, if you like, or certainly subject to tighter measures than other areas. Has that recent dialing up of secure measures had a secondary impact on production?
For us, not yet, no. We took the view very early on that, based on medical advice, the safest thing, masks, hand washing aside, is to maintain 2 metre distance between everyone at all times, which is actually in excess of what our government is currently recommending. So we felt that because we were being extra cautious, the fact that Manchester is experiencing, in certain districts at least, a slight uptick in new cases, that actually even if somebody came into our building, God forbid, with coronavirus, because they'd never be passing within 2 metres of anybody else, we'd still be relatively safe. As I'm sure Jason will tell you, we are monitoring the situation daily, and that what we don't want to do is endanger anybody first and foremost. But we feel quite confident with our protocols and confident that, should anybody become ill, the chances of them passing that on at work, there being any onward transmission as a result of work, we think that's quite a slim possibility. So we feel quite comfortable at the moment, but I think we're being ever vigilant, I suppose, in case things get worse.
How about you, Jason? Can you take us through a bit more about the detail of how production has changed on Neighbours?
I guess we've got to go back to the end of March, April, when we resumed production. We sort of hatched a bit of a plan back then. That is by and large still the plan that we're working to today. However, we have evolved it along the way. Like Ian was saying, we went above and beyond what the government was no advice. We sort of had to make our own plan, but it turned out to be over and above what the government was telling us to do and what we know other productions have done. So we sort of began with knowing that we were already really doing a lot more than say was officially required for the health and safety of everyone. So we had that comfort going into it. So really what we did is we looked at our production. We knew that a big issue with coronavirus, obviously it's very contagious and contact tracing is essential. So we looked at our site and our headcount, and we made a decision that we were going to divide the show into different teams that wouldn't cross. 4 major production teams, 2 major cast teams, and we, rewrote scripts and did all of that accordingly as well, so that, these 4 different sections of the show could continue on with any individual coming into contact with less people, number one, than they would normally come in contact with. So if we did have an incident, and we haven't had an incident, but if we did have an incident, we would be able to very quickly be able to say, right, this person has interacted with this person. We'd be able to narrow down very quickly who the individual had been in contact with. And that protocol still exists today. Creative side of it, as we've kind of touched on already, having less people in scenes. We sort of had a blanket ban on extras originally, and then came up with some clever solutions around extras that we've been finessing ever since. So things like that we put in place way back in April when we resumed production. So circling back to your earlier question, I think because we had all of that in place, certainly here in Australia 2.5 months ago at the beginning of June, we thought we'd beaten it. We were down to almost 0. We were having days in Melbourne where there was 0 cases. So as a production, we were cautiously thinking, all right, we will start to be able to do a little bit more. And when the surge happened, it was like flicking a switch. We've got to go right back to the toughest version of this model, along with all the extra health and safety protocols that we'd put in place since and evolved.
What's the size of cast and crew in terms of numbers usually, and what does that look like now?
So it's normally about 150 people full-time on site, freelancers, a lot of casuals, guest cast, a lot of extras, and that included the writing department, for example. So obviously, like all industries, if you can work from home, do work from home. Absolutely applies to us as well. And a lot of people have been doing that and haven't returned to the building since March. Really, with everyone else, it's just been about really looking at the way we schedule the show, really making sure that, we only need these people. We don't need more than this, either to tell our story or for whatever support we need to put around it. So it's just kind of making those judgment calls every day. As we've seen, there's been a community uptick lately in cases, so we were able to go back, remove any, say, people that we started to begin to reintroduce to the site.
How about you, Iain? What's the usual size of the overall cast and crew for Coronation Street? How many people are you dealing with on a day-to-day basis?
We sort of halved the number of people that we've got in studio, so limited the number of cast-in scenes. We've knocked out any members of the technical teams that we can temporarily at least do without, because we've simplified the way we film things. So the studio is a lot more of a sparse environment than it used to be honest, noticeably so. We, much like Jason, have taken the view that separating people off into discrete working groups or cohorts, as we've been calling them, is the safest way to operate, to limit the number of times people cross with each other and limit, therefore, any potential chains of transmission across the site. So we've approached it in a very similar way. I'm banned from studio, for example. We're being that draconian about it, that nobody who is not on a particular filming cohort is allowed in there, and not even me. So we've been very, very rigorous. But I am assured that there are far fewer people in there, even though I can't go and see the evidence of it with my own eyes. It's funny that one of the things that we've encountered is that a lot of people obviously have been working from home, and a lot of people have also been furloughed, so staying at home and not working. And they are desperate to get back into the office, but doing a job that sometimes requires me to go into the office. It's funny because I feel like saying to them, it's not the same place anymore. I know you want to go and sit in the canteen and chat with your friends, or go down to the breakout area and mix with the crew and catch up about filming, or go in studio and watch some filming. You can't do that anymore. So it's a strange state of play where lots of people are clamoring to get back in the office, seeing it as a return to normality. But actually, the office is very far from normal at the moment. It's very sterile, and I use that word advisedly. But it's been strange, really, to see the kind of bustling site. And it's a sociable industry. People chat and bounce ideas off each other, and they're all in each other's space all the time. And suddenly that's all stopped like this. It's very surreal.
Does that cause challenges for creating a team ethic? Because obviously, when you've got 150 people working towards the same aim, which is producing this, piece of content which is loved by the nation. That must have an effect on the ability to create that team ethic.
It does really, yeah. And I guess that's where Jason and I come into play, really, because we've got all these disparate sub-teams, whether that be the writing team or the camera team or the sound team, that could quite easily feel like they're all separately beavering away on their little piece of the jigsaw and then lose that sense of collaborative working and creative working. So me and the other senior leaders within the show are very conscious of that. I mean, one of the early decisions we took was that we have to somehow find a way to keep our writers' story conferences going. The way our show works, and it might well be the same at Neighbours, I'm sure, is, we'd normally have a monthly meeting where all the writers, 20, 30 of us, would get in a room and just spend 2 days thrashing out what it is that we want to do on the show for the next 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, and coming up with all the storylines. And clearly now we can't do that. So we thought, well, that there is an option to just scrap that. I mean, some of the shows work in a different way where the writers are less involved directly in the shaping of the narrative for the show. And mostly it's the producers and a more scaled back team that would do that and come up with all the ideas, and the writers would essentially implement them in the script. But that's never been the way Corrie's worked. So right at the start of this, we thought, well, how do we manage to run a story conference and keep all these writers engaged when you can't get them in the same room? And that's been a real challenge. I know we're all used to video calling and video conferencing now, but if you can imagine 28 very opinionated people pitching and shouting and counter-arguing each other on a Zoom call, it could easily have been chaos. Even stuff like that where you think, oh, it's easy, we'll just get them all on a video call. That required sort of meticulous planning and sort of mind-bending technical stuff. So it's stuff like that where you have to somehow find a way to keep all these people engaged, because the easiest thing to do would just be to send them their brief, let them get on with it. But I think what makes these shows magical is that kind of family vibe and that collaborative feel. And let's be honest, we both put out such a vast amount of minutage week by week that unless you've got everybody pulling together, it just wouldn't happen. So it's really business critical to keep people engaged.
And so for you, I suppose it's a different type of challenge. It's like a leadership challenge, right?
To a certain degree, both of us, I would imagine, have to be that kind of figurehead in tough times. And all soaps go through tough times, probably none as tough as this, but I'm sure Jason will have worked through crises of one type or another where in a smaller way, you've got a really big story about a particular character who suddenly becomes unavailable. And then you're up till 1 a.m. reworking scripts to be shot the following day. And we've all done that, but this is that, but writ large. I don't think any of us ever envisaged having to be in this position. So it has been a challenge. I'm very fortunate in that I'm married to the assistant producer. So we pull together and, divide and conquer and can split the job list in some cases. And that takes a lot of the load off. But yeah, I think there's a lot of pressure on people in our jobs at this kind of time, much as there is across the world for anyone in a leadership position.
And Jason, so we've seen the way that unscripted has started to return to production, whereas, the bigger scripted dramas are still a little bit away from that. Looking at Neighbours and Coronation Street, essentially you're almost a template, aren't you, really, for drama production in a way. They'll be presumably looking to you to say, okay, how do we do this? How do we get the show back on the road? How do you see the future for drama production?
I'm hopeful with other productions. I think probably the biggest surprise for me was the number of other productions that I've managed to connect with now all over the world. And, at Neighbours, we actually didn't realise we were the first show back in production until people told us we were. It was quite a surprise to learn that. And you have to find the positives in a time like this. And I have to say, hearing from so many colleagues, because I feel like as an industry, worldwide, we are in this together as well. We've become a very global industry anyway. And what happens in one country does affect another. And in this case, it's the world. So it has been a very positive thing for me that I've managed to talk to people and build relationships with people all over the world now. And I think we're all in the same kind of position. In terms of drama, I mean, obviously the landscape has changed significantly in recent years. We know that viewers more than ever want content, and there is more and more content being made, and there's more and more of a demand for content to be made. So that's ultimately a very good thing for our industry. I guess it's just we're watching what happens in the world, the same way every industry does. And fortunately at Neighbours, as you've mentioned, and at Coronation Street and some other shows, we have found a way to keep our shows running. Probably agree with this, Ian. I think the thing that benefits Neighbours, Coronation Street and other soaps is that we predominantly film on our backlots. We have an enormous backlot at Neighbours, not as big as Coronation Street, which I got to go to a couple of years ago, but we have a very big backlot and we can contain pretty much everything apart from the street, which is a real life street. Although we've built backyards and so forth on site, we can, when we need to, contain the entire production on our site. And there aren't that many drama productions that can do that. Most of them do have to go out into the world, are filming in real locations. That, I think, is the big difference that stopped a lot of high-end dramas getting back, is just the scale of them, the number of people involved, and the fact that they've got to go out into the world, and they're not allowed to go out in the world at the moment.
And obviously it's studio space, I guess, is another big issue there, because there's going to be a backlog. Somebody's put a log in the dam and it's going to get taken out at some point, and then it's like when everybody's ready to start venturing out, it's like, well, the studio's price is presumably going to be at an absolute premium.
Again, we're lucky at Neighbours. I know Coronation Street is the same, that we have a big site. But you're absolutely right. I mean, we're looking at other productions at the moment, and we can see there's going to be a cluster when the green light is lit for them all to get back up.
Ian, have any other drama producers been in touch with you for tips and for a bit of advice about how they're going to get back to work?
With the production as a whole, not with me specifically, really. But as Jason's saying, all over the globe, people are sort of peering over the fence at what everyone else is doing, going, how are they doing that? So there's been a lot of collaborative efforts gone into what we're doing. It's certainly in the UK, the whole soap industry has gone at this with common purpose, and there's been lots of sharing of best practice across, EastEnders and Coronation Street and Emmerdale and Hollyoaks and everybody, because it's in all our interests to keep this fantastic genre alive, really. Just to echo what Jason's saying, we are incredibly fortunate that we can just pull up the drawbridge and make our show on site, really. And that was one of the first things we had to do, was stop location filming, because typically out of a 10-day shoot for a week of episodes, we might have had a day, possibly two, where we might have done some location stuff, and that instantly went in the bin, which wasn't without its challenges. But I have counted my blessings several times that we've got this brilliant bespoke facility to use, and it's just forced us actually to refocus our storytelling on the geographical locale of Coronation Street, and Coronation Street's cobbles are almost as much of a character as some of the characters, if you see what I mean. So refocusing the action onto our lot and onto those cobbles has actually been a good thing, I think, in a lot of cases. So, but yeah, it was funny with the exterior studio space. There was a period where you could have picked up a whole studio complex for peanuts if you're doing what we're doing, because nobody else was filming. But it will, I think, very quickly swing the other way, where it will be standing room only. Actually, it's good for us that we have brought all our filming back to site, because I think when all the other dramas fire up again, as you say, you won't be able to get a studio for about a 150-mile radius of Manchester, I wouldn't have thought.
So now it's time in the show where we get to look at your hero of the week and who or what you're going to tell to get in the bin. Jason, coming to you first. Who's your hero of the week?
Okay, a real gear change, but I did see that some past participants had gone to politics. My life at the moment is the show, my family, lockdown, and American politics. My absolute hero is Kamala Harris, closely followed by Michelle Obama. I'm just, filled with such hope and such warmth and respect for what's coming out from those voices in America at the moment. And I'm going to stick with the VP and put Mike Pence straight in the bin.
Right. Okay. Ian, how about you? Who's your hero of the week?
Well, oddly enough, similar territory, really. And I back in a previous life, I was a journalist. So I'm always very admiring of journalists sort of sticking it to the man. And I'm sure you probably all saw a journalist from Huffington Post called S.V. Date earlier asking Donald Trump whether he, quote, regrets all the lying, close quotes. And I just thought, okay, as an out-and-out pure act of journalism, he knew he was not going to get an answer from the president on that point. So you could argue it's just a bit of grandstanding and a bit of provocation. But on the other hand, I mean, high five to that man. I just thought it took some real chutzpah to just come out with that straight to the most powerful man on the planet, we're told. So good for him. And in terms of who or what should get in the bin, to avoid being too party political, I will merely say the A-level exam fiasco, just all of that needs to go in the bin. And I'm sure I speak for a whole swathe of 17, 18-year-olds who had their hearts broken over this. That whole thing just needs to be put to bed permanently. I thought it was a complete shambles, and I felt for them, really. It's just having gone through 3 months of isolation and anxiety and not seeing your friends at a time of your life when that's like the most important thing, to then suddenly be told that you're not going to get to go to university because some algorithm decided you weren't worthy of the grades you thought you were. I mean, what a mess. So stick the off-qual exam algorithm in the bin. There you go. That saves me having to name a person.
Yeah, excellent. Jason, Ian, I really appreciate your time. It's pretty rare, I think, to have two production leaders from the best known and best loved and longest running soap operas that mean so much to so many people around the world. So thanks again for your time. Good luck with production. Good luck with keeping those shows going. And thanks again for coming on the show.
My pleasure, and thank you.
Thank you as well, and great to talk to you too, Ian.
Yeah, likewise. And can I just finish by saying hats off to you guys. The whole planet was watching what you were doing and getting back to filming so quickly, including us. And we pored over every detail of what you did, and it was meticulous and brilliant. And, a large part of what we are doing now is based on what you were doing there. So, yeah, hats off to you.
Well, thank you. And I'm just happy you're continuing, and good luck to everyone.
Yeah, Godspeed.
So now it's the time in the show where we usually hook up with K7 Media's Gert Sleesis. But he's travelling this week, and I'm delighted to welcome a rather able replacement. Perhaps the TV industry's most experienced senior creative executive, Gary Carter. Gary, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
So we know you for your time working with Planet 24, Endemol, Fremantle, Endemol Shine, etc., and working with some of the world's most successful formats. And now you're on the board at K7 Media, amongst other businesses. But what I wasn't aware of is your passion and your experience in the soap opera genre, which we're focusing on this week. Tell us a little bit about that.
I know, I guess it sounds a little bit unlikely, maybe. I trained originally as an actor. And while I was training as an actor in South Africa in the 80s, it was also the last wave of radio soap opera in South Africa. So television arrived in South Africa about 75, 76, and even then was very limited to an hour first a day and then 2 hours a day. As a result, there was a very, very strong radio habit, and mornings were dominated by radio soap operas. And I essentially put myself through drama school by appearing in two long-running radio soaps, The Valiant Heart and Berenice, Queen of the Jews, was the other. I started working, and I became fascinated with their ability to reflect and influence society. When I stopped working in the theatre, I began working as an agent for Tony Hancock's brother, the late Roger Hancock, and his business partner, Brian Codd. And they represented a generation of comedy scriptwriters, producers and directors who'd gone from the music hall into radio, into television. And working with writers was very much the stuff of the agency. And the directors had quite an editorial role. So I kept my relationship with writing, as it were, during those 10 years. And although when I went into television, it was indeed on the side of non-scripted development and specifically reality television, if you think about reality television for a moment, you'll realize there is a link between that and soap opera. In fact, when we first developed Big Brother at Endemol, we used to refer to it as a real-life soap. And we often used the expertise of soap opera writers and producers in setting up the production of the show. And when I went to Fremantle, of course, I discovered this large catalogue of European and Australian soap operas, from Neighbours to Goede Tijden, Slechte Tijden in Holland, where I live today, and across Europe. And I learned about soap operas from one of the great masters of European soap opera production, a venerable Australian gentleman called Mike Murphy, who is now in retirement in Australia. He worked in soaps from the 70s, and I learned a lot about soap opera and a love of soap opera from Mike Murphy, from whom I took over as head of worldwide drama.
Soap operas are obviously a staple in many territories around the world, the cornerstone of many schedules with some of the world's biggest broadcasters. What makes them so popular and enduring?
The answer to that is both their popularity, but also the volume of them. They are the last of the very long-form popular genres. And of course, although they are expensive, very expensive in terms of an annual commitment, at a price per unit price, they're quite reasonable. And they have retail value, as RTL and Fremantle discovered with their soaps. So I think it's a combination of traditionally high viewing figures and centrality in the habits of the viewers. It's the price point from a broadcaster's point of view, and I think as a subsidiary impact for the industry, although that is not why broadcasters get into them, they are extremely powerful as talent training grounds, both for performers and for backstage people.
Can you take us through the history of the modern soap opera?
This is my version. It's a bit partial, right? So, because I'm not an historian of soap operas, but I make a distinction between European and Australian soaps and British soaps and American soaps. American soaps tend to be what Americans would call aspirational, very, very glossy, improbable, extremely good-looking people, and very, very sort of dynastic in their structures and their concerns, with clear villains and heroes. They also, as a form, pretty much are dead, right? I mean, they have all been decommissioned, sadly. The European ones and the Australian ones we can link together because the European soaps, by and large, and it's not entirely true, but it's generally true, are the descendants of Australian soaps. I'll come to that in a minute. Then we have a very powerful flowering of popular soap opera-like structures in the Southern Hemisphere. So in South Africa, there is an extremely vibrant soap opera production business, a large number of soaps on screen. You get a similar position in Latin America, where, of course, they've taken a slightly different form in that they typically are telenovelas. They are long arc stories with an ending, Ugly Betty being the classic. And then there are a few outliers. I can't speak about Asian soaps, but there are a few outliers even in our territory, in the sense, or my territory in Europe, in the sense that there are Turkish soap operas which are very powerful and others like that. But really what I know are the Western European ones, the Australian ones, and the British ones. And in last 3 or 4 years, I've started to work amongst the British ones because I consult to Channel 4 and Lime Pictures on Hollyoaks. The reason why I say that the European soap operas are the descendant of Australian ones, and the connection between my work in the format industry and soap operas is that most of the European soaps, the primary ones that are still on air, were sold into Europe by Grundy Television as formats. Grundy, of course, was then acquired by Pearson, and Pearson is, of course, one of the dominant parts of Fremantle. And so these European foreign language or non-English soaps descended from Australian ones are still very vibrantly alive in countries like Germany. And the aforementioned Venerable Mike Murphy is the reason why that happened. When Grundy began to make an export business for itself from Australia, Mike was a key executive in selling formats and expertise, very, very tightly bound together, because in soap opera, more than in any other genre, perhaps there's a time-money equation of great complexity. Mike sold those formats into Australia. So as a result, Neighbours has 2 European cousins. There's A Place in the Sun in Italy, and there's Among Us in Germany. And Good Times, Bad Times in Holland, and Good Times, Bad Times in Germany are the descendants of a sale of The Restless Years to RTL Holland and to RTL Germany. When Pearson formed into Fremantle, the Worldwide Drama Department continued to develop formats for European soap operas, largely driven by Australian and New Zealand writers hired by Mike Murphy. And so the Finnish soap opera, the last remaining and only soap in the Nordics, Secret Lives, was developed in that kind of way. And the late Croatian soap opera, Rose of Love, likewise. Soap operas themselves came into this landscape in the 80s, at the time that European broadcasters were commercializing and indeed launching commercial broadcasters. These were sold to commercial broadcasters as a way of defining their brands as different from the public broadcasters in Europe. And the lasting legacy, which is largely kind of untold stories, is of drama formats preceding the rise and the traveling of game show formats and later reality formats and other forms of formats. And also that we have some unlikely partnerships. So in Holland, where I'm talking to you from at the moment, Goede Tijden, Slechte Tijden, Good Times, Bad Times, the descendant of the Restless Years, with a cousin in Germany, is on RTL and is a co-production, although most people wouldn't know this or titularly acknowledge it, is in fact a co-production between now Banijay and Fremantle. These kinds of relationships, I guess, are so much part of the landscape, and because they're scripted, we don't think of them as being about formats, but indeed they are.
In a sense, did this export of soap opera from Australia, did that really pave the way a little bit for the formats industry as we know it today?
Well, certainly Grundy learned a lesson or two in that business. I mean, Grundy, I think we can say, was the first perhaps non-American or English actor in the international format business at scale. Certainly when I started working in the format business in the mid-80s, it was all about the non-scripted side. And indeed, although if you look at the sales of scripted formats, as set out in Chalabdy's The Format Age, which is now several years out of date, you can see a growth of scripted formats, but nowhere near the volume of non-scripted formats. And it's almost like we've forgotten that heritage. Although, from a legal point of view, of course, the claim to copyright in the format for a drama is far higher than the claim to copyright in a non-scripted format. But you don't need a lesson in law from somebody who's not a lawyer on this podcast, Justin.
No. That's fascinating, actually. I wasn't aware of really the lineage, if you like. But looking at soaps and their role, because obviously they have an important societal role, as well as there being an important commercial driver for lots of broadcasters. But what's their role for society? Is it to educate or is it to entertain?
You might say it's a mixture of both, but how I think about it is that soap opera is the last vestige, if you like, of a kind of popular theatre expressing debate, satire, and seriousness about society. And as good soap operas mirror and shape public opinion simultaneously. And because they produce in such volume, and because of the nature of the subject matter, and I guess we'll come back to that in a while, and because of the fact that soap opera producers tend to be very, very serious, and writers tend to be very, very serious about communicating with their audience, even though the industry itself is quite flippant and dismissive of the genre, a lot of charities and public bodies want to work with soap operas because the heartland subject matter is very, very close to them. So, for example, if you are like Channel 4 did last year, in Hollyoaks, if you're dealing with the grooming of a 16-year-old boy by a pedophile football coach, the writers and producers and the broadcaster feel very strongly the responsibility to tell that story accurately. And the bodies that deal with those kinds of cases, from the police to social work departments, indeed to individuals who suffered that experience themselves, are very keen to work with Line Pictures and Channel 4 in accurately expressing it and providing the support that people who have suffered similar experiences may need off screen. Although the industry is very, very dismissive about soap, although sectors of the audience would be dismissive of the soap, we know from the viewing figures that it's a very, very vibrant site of popular culture. And we also know from the responses and the feedback that a show like Hollyoaks gets that there is a very, very deep relationship between our audience and the stories that the genre tells.
Well, we heard earlier on in the show from Jason and Iain from Neighbours and Coronation Street about their approach to addressing coronavirus head on in their storylines. Should soaps be tackling the coronavirus in the storylines head on?
It's my personal view that not quite as you phrased it. So first of all, in the shutdown, in working with Channel 4 and in working with the Hollyoaks team, there was a lot of debate about whether when we came back we should show coronavirus at all. whether there should be any sign of impact. And indeed, I argued very strongly that there should be, and I'll come to why in a moment. As somebody who works creatively with soap operas, I'm very wary of hospital-driven storylines, right? So illness-driven storylines are one of the signs of kind of decay in a soap opera to some extent, or at least of kind of fatigue in the writer's room, I would argue. So I would never argue for corona stories. In discussing coronavirus, certainly with the show that I work on, Hollyoaks, there were two issues we had to take into account. The one was, what is our responsibility to a young audience? Because unusually for British soaps, we have a young audience, 16 to 34, as our heartland audience. What is our responsibility to them? Leave aside anything else. Secondly, what are the facts of production that we are about to encounter? And if you were to choose not to show the impact of coronavirus at all, you have a problem in that you have a world in which you are producing with COVID-19 prescriptions on how you behave and how you shoot, but you can't adequately explain it. On the other hand, if you're going to allow COVID to enter the world, you might run into the risk of audience fatigue if you tell stories that are driven by COVID. So in formulating that, we came down to a sort of three-part equation. And indeed, I should pay tribute to a friend of mine who used to work in the industry because he formulated it like this way. So this is a bit of a shout out to the former head of development at World of Wonder. In discussing it with him, he formulated it as follows. He said that the subject matter of all soap opera is social relations. COVID has changed social relations. Social relations interesting, COVID not interesting. That really neatly sums up my personal position, the position of the show that I work with, and probably all certainly the UK ones, and some of the ones internationally. I think if you were to pretend that COVID had not happened, and of course it's difficult because some soap operas have a lot of episodes on the shelf, right? Sometimes too many. That may sway you one way or another. But I think if you chose not to show COVID, you betray your audience, frankly. And you also make it almost impossible to explain now why nobody is sleeping together, why nobody's touching together, why nobody's eating food, why there are no crowds in the pub, why their business, all of that stuff.
Just hearing from Iain on Coronation Street, he was saying that they really represented it with a very light touch. So, for example, in the Rover's Return pub, which is one of the key sets, they have the social distancing warning posters. So they are light touch, still in shot. People obviously are aware and familiar with those posters, but they're perhaps not being the centre of that storyline. They're obviously showing that coronavirus is present, if you like, but it's not a central arc of a storyline.
I think that's the right decision. We have similar things when we return to the screen after the COVID hiatus. As you will see in Hollyoaks, we have similar things. We have storylines that are clearly subtextually driven by coronavirus, where coronavirus is not articulated, but we're not dealing with stories of death and illness from coronavirus. Some businesses might be suddenly bankrupt, but we won't necessarily give a reason as to why.
Hollyoaks, is that back in production yet?
Yeah, Hollyoaks is back in the studio, I'm happy to say.
Right. There's a benefit for soaps because of their sets. Certainly, they are closed sets, and the ability to go back into production is really sort of preceding a lot of the wider, more high-budget dramas because obviously locations and sets isn't an issue. It's there. They already have them. They're pre-built. As long as they can manage the socially distanced challenges and staying within government guidelines of being able to film, that's allowed them, in Neighbours' case, to come back, I think, after just a 3-week break, which was extraordinary.
Well, the Germans never stopped at all.
Really?
Yeah, because they're closed studio sets, because their industrial production is how they're defined, and industrial production generally as a category continued. And once the 8 pages of protocols had been agreed between UFA, the Fremantle company, which produces a large number of soaps in Germany, they just continued with production. Quite successfully, actually. And I think that this is one of the things that's been quite interesting for soaps, is that working with a new set of restrictions, I think, has caused a greater emphasis on the writing itself and on the performance of that writing by the actors. The arrival of new limitations have been something of a creative prod to writers and performers because they have a different set of problems to solve than the ones they usually do have.
Over the last few years, particularly the last 5 years, I think we've seen this dawn of a golden age of drama, if you like, emerging, triggered, of course, by the streaming boom. Now, that's obviously on hold now. And just to give an idea of what major dramas have been delayed, there was an excellent piece of the Sunday Times which lists Stranger Things, Succession, Killing Eve, Line of Duty, The Handmaid's Tale, Midsummer Murders, Gentleman Jack, and Peaky Blinders, amongst some of the high-end dramas that are now on hold, or certainly they're not going to deliver and appear on screens until next year. Do you think that there is a link there in terms of drama? Do you think that it could lead to a resurgence for the soap opera, for consumers to need their fix of drama programming? Do you think that that could be something that would lead them back to the linear broadcasters?
And I think, first of all, the idea of a golden age of anything is nonsense if it's defined by the people who lived through it, right? I mean, just as a sort of intellectual exercise, that's nonsense. It's like me telling you what the greatest pop songs of the last 100 years. Well, guess what? They're all going to be pop songs from my lifetime. The fact is that I think that what the streamers did was invest so heavily. So yes, there was a business boom. And because they were streamers and they were largely subscription, they were able to deal with much more complicated, adult, and in some cases sexualized or violent or difficult subjects in a way that network drama, particularly in America, had been unable to do. I suspect that the streamers are currently facing a problem that you don't highlight, and that is that a lot of their commissioning is quite dystopian. They must be wondering, what is the appetite for dystopian, drama with lots of people in fully protective clothing walking through radioactive environments with torches in their hands? What is going to be the audience's desire for that kind of material? Now, we know that soap operas fulfill a kind of societal function. Even a show like Hollyoaks at Channel 4, you might be surprised to learn, still has a large number of its audience watching it in real time at the first broadcast in a social context. And that, I think, is going to grow. That clearly has grown during lockdown. It's the desire for people to have things to watch together, to be collective. I'm not sure that that's going to cause a return to commissioning soap operas. We, as a soap opera community, let's say, have a very important role to play. And I do think that we will get bigger audiences, and coming out of this is going to be an opportunity to bring back lapsed and casual viewers to all of the soap operas. What I don't think is that it's going to lead to the commissioning of more soap operas. They're a very heavy investment. They take 18 months to 2 years to establish. They're enormously complicated, in fact, to cancel once you've established them. And because of their relationship with the brand of the broadcaster, they typically run for very, very long periods of time. So just to summarize, I think that what we will see is renewed audience interest. Well, we know we are seeing that already. We know there's an opportunity to bring lapsed and casual viewers back into the soap opera habit. And perhaps there is a chance to break a particular problem for soap operas. And that is that you are more likely to watch a soap opera if you grew up in a household that watched soap operas. So you inherit this habit from your family. If you grow up in an age of streamers where nobody has shared habits, you are unlikely to find your way to soap operas, I would hypothesize. At a time like this, when we're seeing greater and greater clustering around soap operas, I'm hopeful, because I believe in the vibrancy and the importance of the form, that we will see a new generation get the habit.
We've seen some of the streamers making more and more localized commissions. Do you think there'll be ever a time when one of the major streamers may commission a local soap opera?
I personally think that's a little unlikely. I think it's unlikely because of the scale of the undertaking. While, of course, some of the shows like The Crown have enormous budgets, soap operas require an enormous financial investment, but more than that, an enormous real estate commitment and an enormous commitment to longevity. I know of no countries that have successfully, even though they continuously experiment with it, I know of no countries that have successfully gone from a telenovela structure, a long form but closed arc scripted series, and converted that into a soap opera, an endless soap opera, which has been tried a lot, particularly in countries like Germany and in South Africa, but I've never known it work. I can't imagine that a streamer would go into these kinds of waters, and I can't imagine how it would function in the absence of a schedule, basically. I can imagine how it would function in what is essentially what we used to call the long tail model of streamers. But I think it's unlikely. Also, it requires a particular kind of expertise from the commissioners. Being a drama department in a broadcaster that's looking after several soap operas like at ITV is a particularly relentless and detailed and experience in requiring skill. I don't see streamers investing in those kinds of people in-house.
Gary, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been fascinating. I've learned a lot about soap operas and really grateful for you for spending some of your day with us. And hopefully you'll join us again on the show in the coming weeks.
I would be delighted if you'll have me.
All the best.
Thank you very much.
Well, that's all for this week's show. As always, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Please remember to rate and subscribe to the show and share it with friends and colleagues on social media. If you want to hear about our MIPCOM advertising and sponsorship packages, please email justin@boomdialogue.com. That's justin@boomdialogue.com. TellyCast was edited by Ian Chambers. Next week, we're looking at unscripted formats with two of the TV industry's leaders in the field. So, until then, as always, stay safe.